I've previously described how to read data from an XML file, showing you two different parsers that you can use, and I've also described how to create new rows in an SQLite database table. I'm going to combine these two features. I'm going to use an XML file to seed my application with data, and then move the data over to the SQLite database as the application launches for the first time. I'll be doing all of the work in the main activity class in this version of my project, importdb. In the main activity class, down at the bottom of the class, I have a method called createData. And right now, I'm creating some fake data. I'd like to replace this code with code that imports from XML and exports to the database. So I'm just going to select and delete all of this code. If you need this code back again, you can find it in the previous version of the project in the Solutions folder. I'll go get code to import the data from an XML file. I'll move back up to the onCreate method, and I'll locate this code that I commented out in a previous exercise. It uses the XML pull parser to read the data from an XML file and returns it as a list of tour objects. I'll cut that code to the clipboard. Then I'll go back down to my createData method, and I'll paste the code back in, and then I'll uncomment it. You might need to do a quick fix to add an import statement for the tours pull parser class. So now I have the tours from the XML file in memory, and I can loop through and easily call the methods in my data source object to pass the data to my SQLite database. I'll use a for each loop to loop through the list of tours. I'll type for each, all one word. I'll press Control Space and choose the for each code template. Eclipse automatically picks up that it's going to loop through the tours collection and create a tour object for each item in the collection. So I'll tab a few times, and now my cursor is within the for loop. Within the for loop, I now have a tour object, and all I need to do is call the create method of my data source class. Remember, when I created the data source class, which is in the DB package, it receives a tour object and it adds it to the database table as a new row. So I'll go back to the activity, and I'll simply call datasource.create, and I'll pass in the tour object. And that's it. I'm pulling the data from the XML file and passing it to the database. Everything else in this application will remain exactly as it was before. Up above, in the onCreate method, I'm doing a find all to get the data from the tours table. Then I'm checking the size, and if it's 0, I'm calling this createData method that I just modified to pass the data in, and then I'm retrieving the data again. So I'll save my changes. Now before I test this, I'm going to go to the emulator and clear all of the existing data to make sure I'm getting a fresh start. I'll go to the emulator, then I'll go to the applications list. I'll click and hold on my application icon. I'll drag it up to App Info, and then after a moment, the emulator will let me clear the data. Then I'll go back to the home screen, I'll return to Eclipse, and I'll run the application in the emulator again. Now, as the application opens in the emulator, it'll query the tours table, it'll determine that there isn't any data in the table, it'll then call the createData method, it'll retrieve the data from the XML file, pass it into the database, requery the database, and then display the data. And so now you have a good example of how you can seed an application with data that you package up as an application resource. To review a couple of things from previous lessons, my XML file is a resource in the Resources folder. I placed it in a folder called Raw, and it's a file called tours.xml. By putting it in the Resources folder, you make it a resource that you can address with a resource ID, just like a drawable image, just like a menu item, or a user interface control. As another reminder, I'm using this class, Tours Pull Parser, but if you prefer, you can use the JDOM parser. Either one will do the job, and which one you use is a matter of taste, depending on how you like to do your coding, and also one of performance, because the two parsers return different results depending on the nature of the XML and the context of your application. Finally, in the main activity, I've added simple logic to determine whether there's data in the application already, and if not, I've added code to move the data from XML to the database.